haven't met a parent yet who has given their child a phone and then later said, oh man, I'm really glad we did that. It's always the opposite. It's always, man, I didn't realize they were going to get into all of this, or I never thought my kid would do that. And it's not because they have bad kids. It's just because they're given access to something that they never should have had to begin with. And so we're putting a lot of responsibility on these kids when it should be the parents controlling that for them instead of making the kid decide to be safe. Let's just keep them safe as parents.
Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of At Home with Emily, a podcast about creating the life you love. I'm your host, Emily Wood, and today we are getting started on a 4-part series about screens, phones, and our kids. So, bringing in with us today is Hannah Laxton from Wellspring Counseling in Republic. And the reason that I brought Hannah in is because, unfortunately, you are seeing, I want to say, the darker side of what is happening as kids are getting their phones younger and younger, and even teenagers. And all of a sudden, they have the entire internet and world at their fingertips, and we're telling them to make good choices. And so I appreciate you guys jumping on with us today, and we're just going to try to get a little bit of insight and talk about what's going on here. So, Hannah, obviously when we were kids, there were still landlines. Yes. Our mom had a cell phone. You know what I mean? We didn't have the same things going on. Right. Screen time meant TV.
Yes. Yep.
It was Mr. Rogers. Mm-hmm. Yep. It was Sesame Street.
It was simple, much simpler.
It evolved into Saved by the Bell. And, I'm a 90s kid.
Yes, me too.
And so then we move forward now. Yeah. And probably, I guess, during college for us. And it's going to be different for everyone. But the smartphone came out. Mm-hmm. And it was like, oh, wow, this is awesome. Yeah. And all of a sudden, everybody had a smartphone. I don't know when it happened to where we decided that our kids needed a smartphone. Right. But when you look at the numbers, we're seeing it go younger and younger, aren't we?
Yes. I actually was looking at a study from Stanford Medicine, and it said that the average child in the United States gets a phone at 11 and a half.
Wow.
And it was staggering. It's not surprising, actually, because of what we're seeing. But when you hear the actual statistics, and then it even said 1 in 5 8-year-olds has a phone. And so it's just shocking, to hear. And, I was a school counselor, and now I own a private practice. And so I have just kind of seen the gamut of parents making the decision to give their children a phone. I have young children myself, and, we limit screen time and do things like that, but it's not common, I feel like, anymore. It's just give them a screen, let them have access to social media, and just trust that they're going to make good choices. And we're just not seeing, and kids don't typically make the best choices, but we're telling
because
them
they're children.
They're children. It shouldn't be
not because they are not good children, because they are children.
Yes, that's just the development of their brain is still learning, and then we're handing them a phone with internet, or we're giving them access to social media, or they're figuring out how to get it because, they're learning from their friends how to access it or things like that. But anyway, I know this is a kind of a heavy example to use, but I feel like we're giving our children a loaded weapon and saying, be careful. And we would never do that. We would never hand them an actual weapon, but the phones have become that. I mean, really. And anything that was made for good can be turned evil. And that's really what we've watched happen with phones over the last 20 years, I would say. But even in the last 5 to 10 years, it has just amplified what the kids have access to.
Well, and just the revolution of it.
Yeah.
How it has happened. Mm-hmm. Because we got to see technology evolve, and we got flip phones.
Yes. Oh, I had T9 texting,
and then it was like, texting. And for them, it's all already there.
Oh, yes.
And there it is.
Yep.
And I feel like, too, remember when we were kids, it would be put the computer in the living room.
Oh, yeah.
So that everybody can see what we're on.
Yes.
Those days are long gone.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I think I see through my office and through my work, even as an elementary school counselor, that parents are giving their kids access to their phones 24 hours a day. Kids are sleeping with their phones, which means they're not sleeping. And that's a whole nother study in itself that we could go into, a whole nother topic about how the lack of sleep is impacting their school and their brains and all of that. But really, like, giving them access to their phones all the time, not having it. I mean, I personally don't believe they should even have them until a certain age. But, if you're going to give your kid a phone and then just let them have it all the time, they're on social media at all hours of the night. They're, watching Netflix and shows and things like that. And their brains are just not capable of handling what their intake is. And then the impact of social media, it's
So
wild.
let's start there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many different ways that we can go. And obviously we just have a little bit of time. But when we look at social media, I work with teens, as you know, and I have heard teens say, I wish my parents didn't let me have social media.
Yeah.
At age 12 and 13.
Yeah.
What are we seeing here? We've heard about cyberbullying, so we know other kids, but there is a mental health struggle, right? I mean, we've seen states like New York is trying to pass legislation. I mean, they're just throwing up anything they can to try to make it less addictive. And we hate to use that word, but it's the truth. And we're all addicted to our phones. And so, of course, your child's going to be because they don't have the self-regulation. True? That an adult has.
Well, we hope adults have it. I mean, but I'm sure you and I can look at seasons of our life where we didn't even feel like we controlled, like there's times where we're like, man, I was on my phone way too much today. And that's us as mature adults,
So what's happening with social media specifically? And like you said, too, we know that countless studies have shown that being able to turn off your brain at night as a child and get 10, 12 hours of sleep, how important that is for their emotional and mental well-being. So what are we seeing with the social media and the phones at late hours and unsupervised?
Yeah, I think, first of all, children at a certain age start already playing that comparison game with their peers. They're already struggling with, she's got the coolest outfit. I wish I had hair like that person or played sports like that. But, they all compare themselves to people
just simply at school,
just in real life, in person, much less whenever they have access to social media and the whole world. And then they're playing that comparison game with all of these people they don't even know,
Well, it used to be dangerous. A magazine.
Oh, yeah.
You know how they used to be like, oh, goodness, we don't want our girls looking at this, at these magazines. And these are all airbrushed and unrealistic. Well, it's just nonstop. I mean, what they're looking at now.
And I think that's a big danger, is that constant comparison that's happening whenever you see that. I think social media is putting a lot of ideas into kids' heads that they probably wouldn't have just thought of on their own. They're seeing things, they're watching things that, if they didn't have access to that, they wouldn't even have those thoughts come in their mind. And I think those thoughts that they're having are turning dark very quickly. And that's very scary.
That's what you're seeing in your practice.
Yes. And, and just social media, I think, has a big part to it. I think about, Snapchat, and I was just going to share a story about Snapchat that I had. This was 10 years ago in 2014 when I first started my career. But I worked at a high school, and I was in my graduate program to become a counselor. But I worked in the discipline area, like with the principals and stuff. And I would file all the paperwork and stuff like that. So I was heavily involved in all the discipline. And this one of the first things that came across my desk in September when school had started to file was a picture of a cheerleader, a 9th grade cheerleader, who had taken a nude picture of herself and sent it to her boyfriend through Snapchat because she didn't want to text it because her parents checked all of that, is what she told me. But they didn't know she had Snapchat. So she has Snapchat, it disappears in a few seconds. It's great. It's this, new app that was going around. And she took a nude photo, sent it to her boyfriend. Her boyfriend screenshotted it, sent it to the whole school, and it got around. And that girl who started her freshman year thinking this was going to be a great new journey, starting her freshman year, cheerleader, popular, all these things, dropped out of school, homeschooled. And I don't even know what happened after that, but like that was 10 years ago whenever that was just hitting the scene. And now there's so many other things that have come across. And I know that's not a fun story to hear, and you think that's never going to be your kid. But the reality is, when we hand them phones at such a young age, they're not ready for that. That's a huge responsibility.
And you're talking 14 years old. You're not talking 11.
No, yeah. And that's even teenagers compared to children. I mean, they are all children, but, teenagers compared to younger than that. But it's just, it's so dangerous. And I haven't met a parent yet who has given their child a phone and then later said, oh man, I'm really glad we did that. It's always the opposite. It's always, man, I didn't realize they were going to get into all of this, or I never thought my kid would do that. And it's not because they have bad kids. It's just because they're given access to something that they never should have had to begin with. And so we're putting a lot of responsibility on these kids when it should be the parents controlling that for them instead of making the kid decide to be safe. Let's just keep them safe as parents.
Well, and part of it too is I do think that we haven't had the data.
Yeah.
We haven't seen it as much as what you have.
Yeah.
I mean, in your practice, you deal with this day in, day out, the fallout of children having phones. But for parents, they're thinking, I mean, I'm just speaking from what other parents have told me.
Yeah.
Oh, well, all of his friends have it, and it's just the team, and they all communicate, and I don't want him to be left out.
Right.
Is that not what you hear?
Oh, yes, 100%.
And so there is a peer pressure there.
Yeah.
Well, then he's not going to have friends.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when we talk about peer pressure with the children, the kids are peer pressuring. I think when we use that term, we often think of kids and teenagers, but parents are being peer pressured. Parents are, well, I don't want my kid to be the only one that doesn't have a phone, or everyone else, and it's like the parents are feeling the pressure to do it. And like you said, I see this every day. I mean, I hear the sad stories, and I see the parents sitting across from me bawling because their kids have been attacked by predators online, and things like that. Like, I hear that. But I think we have to stop being naive as parents and think that that's not going to happen too, that could never happen. Or now that we've seen it, and even if you're not like me and you hear it every day, you do hear about it. Unless you have your head in the sand, I think you do see and hear the stories. And I think we just think it's never going to be our kid,
Well, you've made a good point about that when we were talking before, just the fact of, well, I do have a good kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think most kids are good kids.
Most kids are good kids. Yeah. And I think that's not the problem. The problem is not that we have good or bad kids. I mean, that is not the problem. The problem is we're giving them so much responsibility to parent themselves. I mean, we're saying, here's this phone you got for Christmas. It's so fun. It's exciting. Speaking of that, Christmas is coming up. Maybe listen to this podcast. Don't get your kid a phone for Christmas. Anyway, but we're hearing that, and then we're handing them a phone and hoping that they be careful with it, And I know, and we're going to talk about this later, there are parent controls. There are things you can add to that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think too, like you said, what's the reason you're giving them the phone?
Mm-hmm.
What
because if it's to communicate with their friends, you don't feel like that's a strong enough reason.
No, I don't think so, because there are so many ways they can communicate with their friends, even using your phone, like, hey, you want to call so-and-so? Here, use my phone and call, like there are just ways. I have never had a parent give me a reason that we weren't able to kind of debunk that theory as to why they got it. So common ones are, what about when they're home alone? Because sometimes older kids are home, their parents have to run somewhere, whatever, they get home from school earlier than their parents. I don't want them home alone without a phone. I agree. I understand. We had landlines, right? Mm-hmm. So create basically a landline. I'm not saying go old school and get a phone that's attached to the wall, but have a flip phone.
But you could.
You could do that for probably like $5, just for the record, to be cheaper. But you could also just get a flip phone that only has access to phone calls on it, plug it in the kitchen, and leave it there all the time. No internet, no texting, just access to call. I mean, that would be the basic way to eliminate that problem. Oh, they get done with basketball practice early. They need me to come pick them up. Okay, well, according to your child, all of their friends have phones and they have a coach. So use somebody else's phone or borrow your coach's phone. Like there's just any situation that a parent has told me, we've been able, and I ask them the questions. I don't just tell them, don't do it. I just say, okay, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And really, I think it's that they haven't, honestly, like they just haven't thought through all the solutions to why their kid actually doesn't need one. So,
well, kids are pretty persuasive too.
Yeah, they are.
When they want one.
Yeah.
And they're being left out.
Yeah.
And they are being left out.
It's true.
However, you would say, thank God.
I would. And I would say, I know it's hard to make the right decision, but this would be the right decision. It's very hard as a parent to watch your kid want something and you have to be the bad guy and say no. But you're not being the bad guy. You're being the responsible parent by telling them no.
And you as a parent say no to the 10th piece of Halloween candy, and you say no to getting in a stranger's van at the park.
Yes.
I mean, that would just shock us if our child would ever think of that. And don't talk to strangers and stranger danger.
Yeah.
Here's your phone.
Right. Go talk to strangers.
Jump on your video games. Jump into...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And video games, and that to me goes hand in hand with this, because let's pretend your kid doesn't have a phone. You know, let's pretend you said no to the phone, but you said yes to video games, and the video games have access to internet, and the internet opens up this world for people to talk to your child and for your child to talk to strangers.
That's scary.
Yes, it's very scary. But like you said, we teach them stranger danger, but then we give them access to strangers online. And we think because they're not in person and in physical contact with them that it's better. But what I have seen is the predators online. Let's just pretend you trust your child. Okay, I trust you. Do you trust the 40, 50, 60-year-old men and women out there who are predators preying on your child? Do you trust them? Because they are after your children. And this is a dark topic to talk about. We don't want to talk about it because we think it's never going to be our kid. But I can't tell you the number of people that I sit across from. Just a couple weeks ago, I had a family in my office, and they had just gone to the police station before they had come to me, and they were completely broken because they found out their 12-year-old had been talking to a 42-year-old man, sending pictures, talking, communicating. But it started off. He was grooming her. It started off as hey, I'm a 13-year-old also. They talked for 6 months. We think like, oh, a predator's just going to come out and grab our children. No, they groom them.
That's not how it works.
No, they pretend like they're these young kids. They create fake profiles. They put pictures on. You can do all kinds of things. And then it just makes our kids vulnerable. This little girl is still convinced to this day she was talking to a 13-year-old. She was like, no, it can't be. He said this and this. He knew all about school things going on. I mean, they're professionals. They're professional predators, and they're getting our kids to think that they're talking to teenagers, and it's not true, and it's not happening. And so it's just to see those parents. I wish everybody could see that, to be honest. Like, I wish everybody could get a glimpse into one day of watching a parent be heartbroken that their 13-year-old is no longer innocent and no longer naive to what they want her to be, you know? And then you see a dad just in tears struggling. How do I parent a girl who's already been exposed to all of this? And then feeling the shame and guilt of that, you know? So it's heavy. It's heavy. It's not fun to talk about, but it's the reality. And I think we have to talk about it.
At that point that kids have gotten involved in this or gone through this, parents, I think, feel like, how did I miss this?
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm sure you hear that a lot. Yeah. But as you have talked about, even if you are monitoring that phone, there are all kinds of other ways that these exchanges can happen and where wrong turns can be made. I mean, how many of us have, typed in a website that we didn't mean to, or, it's
just on an ad, right? I mean, think about all the ads that pop up on social media and YouTube and all kinds of things where you're like, oh, I didn't even mean to click on that, but I did. And then now I have access to all of wait a minute, and if you don't click out of it, then you're in this world that you didn't even mean, intend to be in. And that's as adults, so. Yeah. Oh, it's just,
and your kids aren't going to understand these things.
No.
But from your standpoint, you're the adult.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Like, I think don't put the responsibility in your children's hands to keep them safe. That's our job. You chose to have children, so keep them safe. That's your main job, and don't make it their responsibility. I think we think our kids are going to hate us, and they're going to, if we set boundaries and we're strict and things like that, they're going to rebel from us. But what I have seen is, think about a school setting. When they're in school, they have boundaries, they have rules, they have things like that, and they thrive. Typically, a typical situation, a kid would thrive. But when they're at home and there's no rules, and they don't thrive, they get into trouble more. They're, all these things. And I think I shared this example with you, but I think about, cattle in a field. My parents are farmers, so that's what I go to. But, you think about cattle in a field, the hot wire and the barbed wire and all of that is there for a reason, to keep those cows safe and to keep them enjoying life inside that boundary. But when a fence breaks, or we just don't have a fence, we say, okay, here you go. Here's some cows in a field with no fence. What happens? They get attacked. They run away. They're no longer safe. It's our job to build those boundaries and set the standard for what we want our kids' life to be, to keep them safe and to offer them a beautiful life. It's not boring. It's not, you were telling me yesterday, your kids have no screen time. And what are they doing? When we talked yesterday, they're outside playing, they're building things, they're crafting, they're right. using their creative minds.
They all of a sudden they find ways to fill their time.
Exactly.
Yeah. And not unsupervised. I mean, they play outside and they create things. They do art hub where the older one teaches the younger one how to draw things. And again, it's not, I don't have perfect kids or a perfect family. And my kids are still a little bit younger. I mean, we're going to be getting to that age where they're friends. They're starting to get the watches now. And then, the phone is the next thing. But I think you have to make a decision as a parent on what's right for your family. And what you are going to do and what you are going to allow your kids to be exposed to. Or not. And so I think that might be a good place to stop this conversation. And then if you wouldn't mind sticking around, I would love to get into, okay, well, what happens if we've already crossed this bridge and we've seen a few things happen that we didn't want to happen, nothing huge yet. Where do we start making changes? How do we do it? What can we implement? What safeguards can we put in there? And I think most importantly, too, for everybody with a tween or a kid is how do we make a game plan as a family as to when is the right time for my child to have access to these things, and how are we going to lay that out as a family?
Yes. That sounds great. There's always hope, even if you've crossed a boundary or your kid has crossed a boundary, there's always hope. And I think that's what we need to get into, that it's hard to hear these stories and things like that, but at the same time, that's the reality. And so we need to protect our children. But if they've already crossed boundaries, there's always hope to restore what has been lost.
Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thank you guys so much for joining us today for this important conversation. And we are going to be talking with Hannah again next time about how do you know when it is the right time to introduce a phone, and what are some safeguards that you can put in place as a family. If you are watching us on YouTube, please be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. You can also follow At Home with Emily and Around the Ozarks podcasts on all of our social media channels, and head to AroundTheOzarks.com to sign up for our daily newsletter so you don't miss a thing. We'll see you next time.